I said, how long have you had it for? He said, I've had it for probably at least 20 to 30 minutes. I said, okay. I said, Dad, you need to call an ambulance now. I didn't want to scare him. I said, you need an ECG straight away, right? You need an EKG to see whether this is an acute heart attack, but you need to call an ambulance. And he was reluctant. I don't know why. The NHS was under pressure. He didn't want to he thought that maybe it was nothing major. And I said, no, listen, hopefully it's nothing major, but you need an ECG, you need to call an ambulance 999. And he didn't want to do it. So it was a back and forth conversation. I called one of his best friends who lives near him. He was a doctor as well. I said, listen, you need to go and see Dad. And he was busy with something, but he said, listen, I'll call him. And in the end, what he did was he called two of his neighbors, who are both doctors, who happened to be home. I think they'd finished work. And so I get in the shower. I said, listen, I'm going to get on the train and come up. I get in the shower, come out of the shower. I call him back, because I was just changing, getting ready to get on the train. And there's no answer. I keep calling, no answer. Then one of his neighbors, a doctor, she answered the phone, and she's hysterical. And she says, Asim, your father's had a cardiac arrest, and we're doing CPR. Now, I went into kind of cardiology, tried to take control of the situation, be as calm as possible mode. And I said, tell me what happened. I said, well, we walked in, we saw him. He was a little bit sweaty. My husband's anaesthetist, he was there. He'd already called an ambulance, called 999, and was on the phone. And while he's on the phone to the ambulance, my dad just keels over. Now, Joe, I've done a lot of work and even published on out-of-hospital cardiac arrests and what determines survival. And if you are going to have a cardiac arrest, if you are unlucky enough to have it, you are super lucky if it's witnessed by two doctors who are going to do CPR and an ambulance has already been called. And we know the ambulance response times in the UK have, and I've published on this stuff, is almost within 8 to 10 minutes in these sorts of calls, they will be there. And your chances of survival are high in that situation, right? You've got CPR, it's witnessed, and they usually get a defibrillator on you within 10 minutes. You've got probably more than a 50% chance of surviving. Ambulance didn't show for 30 minutes. And I remember just FaceTiming them, and they put the cardiac monitor on, and it was a flat line. And I said, there's nothing to do here. Don't show. They carried on. I said, no, just stop. I've led cardiac arrest teams, so I know there's no point just jumping on his chest now. There's nothing that we can do here. And it was shocking beyond belief. I couldn't understand it. My dad was a very fit 73-year-old, He would I consider myself quite athletic, and he would outwalk me when we were going for walks during lockdown. He was very active mentally. He was on TV talking about lockdowns and whatever else. And it didn't make any sense. So two things happened. First and foremost, I organized a post-mortem, but I then also investigated, how has this happened? Why is the ambulance taking 30 minutes to get there? And this links back to some of my earlier work in terms of speaking out, if you like, being a whistleblower. So I get contacted about 2 weeks later because I tweeted it out. My dad was a well-known doctor. It was a big news story in The Guardian. The mayor of Manchester, who was friends with him. My dad was a wonderful human. He said, we've lost one of the kindest souls to ever walk the earth. He was that kind of human. He was that well-loved and liked by people. And I got a phone call from somebody senior in the health department linked to the government called NHS England. And she was crying. She was a nurse, senior nurse, and she knew my dad. And said, "Seems something I've got to tell you." I said, "What is it?" She says, the Department of Health, the government, had known for several weeks throughout the whole country that ambulances were not getting anywhere close to their targets for treating people for heart attacks or cardiac arrest, but had made a decision to deliberately withhold that information. And for me, that was quite upsetting, because if we had known that, I wouldn't have asked him to call an ambulance. The neighbors could have, the nearest hospital was like a 5-minute drive, Joe. They would have, somebody would have taken him there. Even if he had a cardiac arrest en route, they would have been able to get to defibrillator and he probably would have survived. So I thought, this is, I need to do something about this. People need to know, because it was still kept hidden. So I with a journalist in the UK called Paul Gallagher with the Eye, I've done a lot of work with him, great journalist. He then started doing freedom of information requests, getting information from the ambulance service, trying to find out what happened, et cetera, et cetera. And we determined that this was the case, that there was all these delays and it had been going on for a long time. And then I wrote an article in the Eye newspaper It became a BBC News story. But just before I published it, I contacted a cardiologist who I consider to be one of the good guys, Joe. And again, I won't name him. I think it's unfair to name him. And I said, Prof, I call him Prof. I said, I just want you to know this is what's happening. You should be aware of this. And I'm going to, get it out to the public. People need to know, this is a big problem, because it might change things a little bit. It's not, but at least we highlight the problem and try and find solutions. And people then in these similar situations, one of the interesting things is this nurse that called me said to me that 2 weeks earlier, her own husband was playing soccer and came back from soccer with chest pain. She didn't even bother calling the ambulance. This is before my dad had his cardiac arrest, because she knew it wasn't going to get there. She got him in the car, drove down the highway, the freeway, to the nearest hospital, into the accident emergency department, and they diagnosed an acute heart attack and took him for emergency keyhole heart surgery. So she knew this stuff and didn't obviously call an ambulance. So I told this to this professor of cardiology in a text message, and you know what he replied to me? Asim, I wouldn't publicize this if I were you. You're only